All right, rejoining the channel is our good friend Sal Mercogliano, the man behind What's Going On with Shipping YouTube channel, and the guy we turn to when the issues involve the merchant marine. And as frequent viewers will remember, we just had Sal on a few episodes ago. So Sal, great to see you again.
Ward, thanks for having me back. I appreciate it.
So I'd like to start with a scene setter, which is our good friend Heather at the Naval Institute posted this article this morning. Let me just read it. Houthis shoot drones missiles at American-owned bulk carriers. As we've pointed out before, we have to segment between ownership, flagged, crewed, because that starts to be quite a few nations, as we pointed out before, as you pointed out during our previous episode. So let me read this. The Houthis fired missiles and drones at two U.S.-owned bulk carriers earlier this week, U.S. Central Command said Tuesday. On February 19th, the Houthis first fired two anti-ship ballistic missiles at merchant vessel Sea Champion, which was sailing under a Greek flag. One missile exploded near the ship, causing minor damage. The ship was able to continue sailing, according to the CENTCOM release. The ship was, and this is the irony, against this idea that the Houthis are only targeting ships bound for Israel, this ship was carrying grain to Yemen. On the same day, the Houthis fired a drone at merchant vessel Navis Fortuna, causing minor damage. The ship, a U.S.-owned Marshall Island flag bulk carrier, was able to continue its journey to Italy. I assume that means they went through the Suez and got to Italy that way, vice going around to South Africa. The attacks on the two U.S. ships come after the Houthis struck the merchant vessel Ruby Mar, a British-owned ship, which took on water after the attack. The ship's crew was taken to a port by another merchant ship, USNI News reported. So this is the most damage we've seen, as far as I am aware, Sal, to a commercial ship, and they had to abandon ship. And it's still there floating down at the stern. It's not clear what's going to be the disposition of that vessel ultimately. Between February 19th and 20th, U.S. Central Command forces, which included unidentified warships, destroyed a surface-to-air missile launcher and a drone and shot down 10 unmanned aerial vehicles. USS Laboon, which is one of the Arleigh Burkes that we've talked about before in the Red Sea, also shot down an anti-ship cruise missile headed toward the destroyer, according to a CENTCOM release. Houthi leadership has continued to say that it's firing on ships in retaliation for American and British strikes in protest of the ongoing bombardment of Gaza. Quote, what the world is impatiently awaiting is not the militarization of the Red Sea, but rather an urgent and comprehensive declaration of a ceasefire in Gaza for humanitarian reasons that are clear to anyone. The Israeli entity would not have continued its crimes against the Palestinian people in Gaza had it not been for this blind support by the Americans, the British, and some European. Houthi spokesman Mohammed Abdul Salam said on social media site X. And we've talked about Mohammed Abdul Salam before on the channel. So there's that. Hey, let me take a second to talk about the sponsor for this episode, private internet access. When you're browsing online on an unprotected device, that device is transmitting a bunch of information that can be viewed by various entities before reaching the intended website. A virtual private network, or VPN for short, is an app that hides your IP address and safeguards your internet connection through an encrypted tunnel. Basically, a VPN shields your digital life from the eyes of those that are looking to exploit your private information. And did you know that many websites and services across the internet are only accessible depending on your physical location? Streaming services like Netflix, Amazon Prime, Disney Plus, and more have different library options based on where you are. Private internet access helps you overcome these restrictions by giving you the option to choose your IP address from a selection of 91 countries and all 50 U.S. states, which allows you to gain access to websites and services that are only available in those locations. Go to piavpn.com/Ward Carroll to get 83% off private internet access. That's piavpn.com/Ward Carroll to get 83% off private internet access. All this information is in the episode description below, so check it out. In addition, there's been some other developments that inform this episode. And let me do these in chronological order. So this was a CENTCOM tweet from February 17th. Between the hours of 3 p.m. and 8 p.m. Sanaa time, CENTCOM successfully conducted 5 self-defense strikes against 3 mobile anti-ship cruise missiles, 1 unmanned underwater vessel, a UUV, and 1 unmanned surface vessel, a USV, in Iranian-backed Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen. This is the first observed Houthi employment of a UUV since attacks began in October 23rd. CENTCOM identified the anti-ship cruise missiles, unmanned underwater vessel, and the unmanned surface vessel in Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen, determined they presented an imminent threat to U.S. Navy ships and merchant vessels in the region. These actions will protect freedom of navigation and make international waters safer and more secure for U.S. Navy and merchant vessels. So the foot stomper there is the first use by the Houthis of USVs and UUVs. And the last item here that is an update to what we've talked about before is this element, which is on Tuesday, French vessels shot down 2 drones launched from Yemen towards the Red Sea. The French Navy has 2 frigates deployed in the southern Red Sea and Gulf of Aden. Meanwhile, French shipping company CMA CGM said on Tuesday that one of its ships, the CMA CGM Jules Verne, transited the Red Sea under French naval escort after the company suspended transits through the region earlier this month due to the maritime security situation. Quote, in coordination with the French naval forces, the Jules Verne transited the Red Sea without incident, escorted by the frigate Alsace. The news comes after the EU on Monday announced the launch of a naval operation known as Unifor Aspides to protect freedom of navigation in the Red Sea against Houthi threats. Aspides will closely coordinate with Unifor Atalanta, the EU's ongoing counter-piracy operation off the Horn of Africa and Western Indian Ocean. So, Sal, this is the first I've heard of that particular operation. So, what do we think about all of this?
Well, let's go ahead and break down. So, what we're seeing right now is an expansion of the Houthi attacks. What we've seen happen since the Iranian base ship, the Bashad, was taken out by a cyber attack, was we had a period there where there was almost no attacks going on, a very dry period, which was good. The Bashad had gone into Djibouti, and we had believed for a long time that the Bashad was providing a lot of identification and a lot of coordination with the Houthi in their attacks. Now we've seen a series of attacks largely against bulk vessels. And the reason it's against bulk vessels is because this is a type of ship that's going through this area. Almost all the other types of vessels, container ships, product tankers, these are tankers carrying diesel fuel, LNG, liquefied natural gas, liquefied petroleum gas carriers, car carriers, have all basically left the area because it's been extremely expensive to go through because of the war risk. The amount of money you have to pay to go through in case of an attack like we just saw committed against Rubimar made most of those ships head around Africa. And the bulk carriers tend to be lower value. Just the nature of the ship and the cargo tends to be lower value. But now what we're seeing is these attacks have little to no coordination. As you mentioned, they hit a ship that was heading into Aden. Granted, it was heading into a part of Yemen that is opposite of the Houthis, but it was still an element of Yemen. And then Rubimar, a good example here, there's a ship carrying fertilizer, was heading up to Romania. No connection at all to Israel, to even any other connection whatsoever. And so these attacks are becoming really indiscriminate. And what we're seeing here is a further decline in the number of ships that are going through the Suez. Or through the Red Sea, through the Bab el-Mandeb, and through the Suez. So we're down about 50% in terms of the total number of ships going down. 60 to 70% in the overall tonnage. Now, this is having repercussions in the area. The western ports of Saudi Arabia are basically empty. We're having an issue with food delivery into Sudan and Djibouti in the eastern part of Africa. The ports in Jordan and the southern ports of Eilat in Israel are empty. And of course, Egypt is suffering from this. Add to this the other reports you have there. So number one, we saw CMA CGM, which announced very clearly the other month that they're not going to run any ships through anymore because of the risk, have now decided to risk a 13,000 TEU ship running through. Now, the reason they can do that is, number one, the U.S. Navy and the Royal Navy is providing overwatch. They are the monitors. They are between the shipping channel and Yemen. And then to get the ship through, they put on its hip a French frigate to run it through. And what the CMA CGM, which is a French company, is probably doing is paying or charging a premium service to put boxes on that ship to give you an expedited routing through that. So they see that as a wash. They're going to try to get one or two ships through to provide an economic service. Again, it's always about mitigating risks. And in case of shipping companies, it's cost, it's value. But if they can make more money than they're paying out on a voyage like this, they will go ahead and do it. And then the final element you have there is the European Union stepping up their service. We're finally seeing the European Union coordinating a response. But just like they did with the piracy operation, they're running a parallel operation to what the U.S. is running. You know, back during the days of piracy, we had CTF 151 operating in and around Somalia. But then you had Euronav operating with Atalanta in a similar operation. They coordinated, but it really wasn't the same operation with different rules of engagement and operations. And the concern I think I have right now is that we're seeing a kind of bifurcation of the protection scheme that's going on in this region, because you just don't have Euronav doing this. You also have the Indian Navy, you have the Chinese Navy, you have the Koreans and the Japanese out there. And so the fear here is that a lot of these operations are going to take advantage of the U.S. Navy. Again, no one can beat a couple of Arleigh Burke-class destroyers providing a nice screen. But without them, this French frigate could not really escort the CMA CGM Jules Verne through, because they're counting on that. So we're really starting to see an interesting inflection point here. I think it's also important to note that the ships that are running through there largely right now are not American, British, or even European ships, except for this one version here of the Jules Verne. Most of the ships that are coming through this region right now are bulk carriers that are owned by Greece and a few other countries, but they're almost all open registries, Panamanian, Liberian, Marshall Island flags. And we're also seeing Chinese vessels and Iranian vessels go through. And so the question becomes is, how long does the U.S. Navy stay there protecting ships that are not really in the American trade interest or even in the European trade interest?
What we already know from my conversation with Admiral Verissimo is Ike's going to be on station for a considerable amount of time because there's no carrier to relieve them currently. And the necessity of their presence isn't going away in the short term. It's as we're indicating here, it's getting more necessary against the Houthi threat that I thought would already have been mitigated based on the power projection we've done, the actual strikes into Yemen, and our ability to take out their weapons as they're shot at us. We've both shot arrows and archers, but obviously we have no idea, and CENTCOM hasn't made any indication, nor has the Pentagon made any indication to what degree we've impacted the Houthi ability to impact shipping. As you've said, it's having an effect in a negative way to global trade. So the question becomes: is the existence of this understanding that the EU mission predated Prosperity Guardian, right? It was the counter piracy that the Somalis were doing for years and years. The captain, what's his name, Phillips thing. I am the captain now, right? That circumstance years ago, we remember that. But is the existence of another operation some sort of an indictment of Prosperity Guardian, or is this just the French, particularly being the French, and doing things their own way and taking their ball and not going home, but playing their own game?
I think it goes to the issue of how do you resolve this? I mean, do we think we can get a military resolution to the problem? And what we're seeing is we've been striking the Houthi repeatedly, very effectively, but they're still able to launch missiles. And the problem with commercial shipping is, as long as there's a threat, they're going to be on the risk adverse side. And if there's an alternative route, which does exist, 3,500 miles around Africa, they're going to take that. And it's going to be very hard to get to the point where you are 100% sure that no missiles, no threats going to come in. As you mentioned, we're seeing a variety of different threats now emerge, UUVs, USVs, and let alone that the Houthi always have that one magic bullet behind the scenes there, which is mines, which could effectively close everything down. Then the commercial companies are going to keep kind of avoiding around it. The fear I have, again, with the kind of this bifurcation of the military operations, is that we're not applying the political force up against the Houthi too, because we got to get the Houthi to back down, and that's the issue. And unfortunately, they're not going to be deterred by military because they're in alliance with basically the Palestinians and Hamas in Gaza. And that means you have to use leverage against them. If you look at all the elements that we've done before, how did you eliminate Somali piracy? It was, yes, a strong military operation that helped negate piracy, but it was also a land operation. It was the Kenyans, it was the African Union stabilizing the situation in Somalia. Even go back to the Barbary pirates. Yes, we put troops ashore, but it was also a military operation with political elements that we eventually negotiated out a settlement with the Tripolitans. And in many ways, we have to do that now. The problem is we don't dialogue with the Iranians, the very few people who do. And if you're the Iranians, why would you back down in this? You are demonstrating your influence in a way that is a great return on investment. If we go commercially here for a moment, this is a great return on investment. You're shooting a couple of missiles and you are causing havoc across the Western economic spectrum, especially when Iranian oil and Iranian sanctions are really biting into their economy. So in many ways, we're not just waging a military campaign here; it's an economic campaign, and it's a political campaign. It goes into that backdrop that the Saudis and the Iranians have been waging in the Middle East for 20 years now, which is that Cold War between the two of them. And my concern going even further here is that the Houthi are giving a whole batch of players on the world stage a new playbook in how to impact against us. And in many ways, the U.S. Navy is relearning how to protect commerce. You know, the traditional first mission of the U.S. Navy, go back to the Navy Act of 1794 and Ian Toll's 6 frigates. You know, it's commerce protection. We're back into that role, and we can stay in the Red Sea indefinitely. We can. The question is the political will. Will we keep an aircraft carrier? Will we keep 4 Arleigh Burke class destroyers there? Because once they leave, then I think you'll see even more ships leave the area because that protection is gone. Or worse, the ships will flock over to the Chinese protection, which involves just squawking on your AIS that I have Chinese crew on board, I am, Chinese owned, and therefore they can sail really unimpeded through the region.
Let's pull up to 30,000 feet against what you were just talking about. Yes, we can shoot down weapons as they're fired at both warships and commercial ships in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden. We're proving that on a daily basis. We've also gone through the numbers in terms of the number of VLS tubes and the other rounds on an Arleigh Burke class, how many AMRAAMs, Sidewinders, 20 millimeter bullets they have aboard the Eisenhower that CAG-3 can use, the H-60 inventory of Hellfire missiles they can take out small boats with, like they did a few weeks ago. That's something we can do. As you're saying, we can do that indefinitely. As you point out rightly, it becomes a matter of first political will, and then second, the cost ratio does catch up with the bean counters in the Pentagon ultimately. As I've pointed out before, this is why we stopped doing Operation Southern Watch and eventually invaded Iraq, is because Southern Watch, which was very effective, and we had the Saddam regime at parade rest. They weren't going to hurt anybody, but it was expensive with all the airborne tankers and 24/7 sorties, both Air Force and Navy, Northern Watch, Southern Watch, that's expensive. So same drill here. And this is just based on CENTCOM tweets, if every day you're shooting somewhere between a dozen to 2 dozen SM-2s, AMRAAMs, and Sidewinders at drones and ballistic missiles and anti-ship missiles, that adds up. The question now becomes, what do we do beyond this shooting arrows and occasionally going after archers? And this is outside of the political arena, because as you rightly point out, it would be optimum if we had some sort of political dialogue with particularly Iraq, which isn't happening, and as a proxy Yemen, but that's not in the cards in the near term. So we've got to stop the supply chain, because what is happening here, and this is what we're hearing from Houthi sources, and this is what is kind of appearing to be obvious based on the battle damage assessment following these strikes that hit upwards of 125 targets per, mission. And they're coming back fighting with even more emboldened activity and more inventory. So the analogy I'm using is, this is like your local convenience store that has no storerooms. And you're always wondering, why is there always an 18-wheeler pulled up to the 7-Eleven every other day? It's because as soon as the shelves run out, they need another truck to pull up and give them the stuff they're going to sell in the short term. There's no storeroom. So Yemen, and particularly Western Yemen, the Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen, are able to sustain these attacks because they fire what they got and then they wait for a resupply, which is coming just in time from Iran and the other black market sources that feed them their weaponry. So we've talked about bunker busting and going after storage facilities, but there's not a lot of inventory there. And they also have mobile sites, including their search and track radars on the coastline, that can move around. So again, this is why we're not hearing, how has our effort netted out so far with diminishing Houthi capability? I'm thinking that's probably not an amazing story based on the effort that we've made. And so now it becomes, okay, we're not going to put boots on the ground. That's just not going to happen. Not even special ops, Delta, SEAL teams going in there to hit certain things. It's not going to happen. And remember, we got burned at the beginning of the Trump administration doing a raid, a SEAL Team 6 raid into Yemen that went poorly. So I'm thinking the way we've got to go, as you say, we're at an inflection point. It has to be more Iranian supply chain facing.
The analogy I keep coming back to is, you're going to try to cut off supplies heading to Yemen. And again, there are difficulties in that. We witnessed that in Vietnam with operations where we tried to cut ocean supply lines to the Viet Cong, to the NVA in South Vietnam. It became very difficult, but it was a big mission that was executed by the United States. Operation
Well, not to mention the Ho Chi Minh Trail, right, which went through Laos and Cambodia, and that created all kinds of controversy when we tried to go after that.
It did, and we just had an operation where a U.S. Coast Guard fast response cutter did a interdiction operation, captured a dhow that was loaded with equipment. And so I think you could do an interdiction operation. The fear you have is you reverse blockade Western Yemen, but then you may cut off food supply. And so you got to be careful about this. I mean, obviously the thing that's hindering everything right now is there's no overarching UN sanction, for example, or UN operation here that gives a lot of credence to the operation, which you would never get because China or Russia would veto it. I don't think you would ever get it out of the UN, which is something that you were able to do in previous operations. Southern Watch, for example, in operations in and around Iraq for many years. And so you have to start looking at, all right, how do you start minimizing their role? And understand, once you start minimizing the role, once you start minimizing the threat, you'll see the return of commercial shipping to the area. But what we're seeing right now is two attacks, the one on the Marlin Luanda, which was a product tanker, which very nearly lost that vessel. The only reason Marlin Luanda was not lost, is the tanker, which had that epic fire on board, was it's clear the warhead did not explode. What they basically did was punch a hole in the top of the tanker, ignited the naphtha, which is basically untreated gasoline. And because if that had exploded, it would have penetrated the other tanks, and you would have lost that vessel. And here we see the issue with the Ruby Mar, which is probably going to be the first constructive total loss, if not sinking, we've had in this operation. I mean, they penetrated the engine room, ship's partially loaded. It's got very little buoyancy left. It's going to be a hard tow back into Djibouti, and it's a 30-year-old ship. Very unlikely they save it. And so what you got to do is try to minimize what the Houthi are doing. But again, the root of this all goes back to Israel and Hamas. And unfortunately, I think too, even if that situation gets resolved, I'm not sure the Houthi and the Iranians stop this operation, because they're getting a lot of return on investment on this, especially the Iranians. They are seeing this. Remember, we've seen Iranian tankers get seized by the United States. We've seen this kind of tit for tat going back and forth and the grabbing of tankers. We've seen attacks by the Iranians in and out of the Straits of Hormuz over the past 3 years. And now what's better for the Iranians is to let a proxy state take all the flack for them, let them do it. And what they can do is just keep playing this against the West. And they're doing very efficiently at doing that. And this is my fear is I don't see a real end scenario to this that ends very well. And understand, even if it ended tomorrow too, I got to say, it's going to take months to reset the global supply chain because now we're diverting around. And so the impact of this across the commercial spectrum is going to be felt for a long time. So even if we start tomorrow, we're talking 3 months to reset everything.
Sal Mercogliano is the host of the What's Going On with Shipping YouTube channel. Highly recommend you subscribe to it. And Sal, we look forward to having you on again very soon.
Thanks for having me again, Ward. Always a pleasure.
That'll do it for this episode. If you're not already a subscriber, become one so you don't miss anything going forward. And in the meantime, I look forward to talking to you again very soon.